Good to see you tonight. We are in 1 Samuel. You already turned there? That's where we are. 3 chapters tonight. You know, sometimes we have 3 chapters and there's not that much storyline to cover, you know. But in this case, it's 3 chapters of heavy storyline. And I don't know how we're going to cover that, because there's actually a lot to talk about. But we're going to see what we can do. So we've kind of jumped out of the last part of Judges here, just trying to stay with the 15 judges that we're trying to get through. On number 14 tonight, as we talk about Eli. And so we've talked about Othniel and Ehud and Shamgar and Deborah and Gideon and Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Japheth, Isban, Elon, Abdon, Samson. We spent a lot of time on Samson, but here we are now, the last 2, Eli and Samuel. So there's a bit of storyline with Eli, but it's going to come to an end. But Samuel, we're going to be with Samuel for a while, because he continues in the storyline in 1 Samuel. And boy, there's a lot that goes on with him. But tonight we're actually going to talk about Eli and Samuel, but Samuel just when he's a child. So here we go. Samuel's going to be such a key figure in the story going forward. Let's look at our map here for just a moment. Let's get our feet on the ground. His father, Elkanah, lived in Ramathaim. And so just looking on the map here, let's get this in our mind where he is from. And Shiloh over here, because that's going to come into our storyline here as well. We spent a whole lot of time here in our last lessons down here with the Philistines and dealing with them. We're kind of out of that part right now, and we've moved up just a little bit. So when we talk about Shiloh, we're going to see that that's where the tent is at, the tabernacle. And it is permanently stationed there for a while, for a period of time. Elkanah, again, Samuel's dad, had 2 wives. Hannah had no children. She becomes a part of our storyline. Peninnah bore sons and daughters. And that was not a great relationship between the 2 wives, because Peninnah taunted Hannah over and over about the fact that she had no children, but she did. So let's go to Shiloh for a minute. Kind of an interesting, well, we need to go forward here. Kind of an interesting picture here, and a place to go. You know, we can pretty much depict what the tabernacle or the tent of meeting looked like. Because in Scripture, and we've talked about this some already, there's such an incredible description of it. When someone here a few years ago said, let's build a life-size, detailed replica of the tent of meeting, they were able to do that. Well, now it's not in Shiloh. Actually, this is down to the south in the Araba, down near the Red Sea, okay? It's a site that you can travel to and you can go and see this. But we're just looking at this picture because we're about to talk about Hannah and Eli at the temple. I just want to have this picture here in our mind. And again, remember Shiloh, that this is actually in Shiloh in our storyline. And so looking at this just a little bit more, and our text. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 1. We're going to read a little bit beginning in verse 9. Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. And now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. Can we just imagine that just a little bit, where he would be sitting just outside the doorpost of the temple? In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. No razor will ever be used on his head. This is Hannah's prayer. This is her plea. And Eli is witness to this. He sees and he hears, or at least sees that she's praying. He doesn't really know what she's saying, but he sees her lips moving this way. And so it was there as she is praying that she makes a vow to God. We're back to that Nazirite vow again that we talked about so much with Samson. And in verse 12, it goes on here just a little bit more. And as she kept praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and he said to her, "How long would you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." "Oh, not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying out here of my great anguish and grief." And Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." And she said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downtrodden. Interesting just to try to get all that in your mind and understand what was going on and what was Hannah's purpose and what Eli was witnessing when he saw these things. And how Hannah said to him, I've been pouring out my soul to the Lord. I want you to think about this a minute. In fact, I'd like to hear what you have to say. When you think about Hannah's prayer, what are some thoughts that come to mind? Not just about the prayer or about Hannah. But what are some thoughts that come to mind when you think about Hannah and her prayer?
She wanted a child.
She wanted a child. Okay? Go on. What else? Desperate. She was desperate. Okay?
I think that she did not allow any distraction because
she was so focused. No distraction. It's like she didn't know Eli was there. Didn't even know that he was watching these things. Okay? What else? Had deep faith. Faith is evident, Joe.
I had a question. How close were women allowed to get to the tabernacle?
Well, we will see that there are some women who work in the service. I'm taking it in the courtyard, perhaps, of the temple. Sometimes when it says, Eli was at the doorpost, remember, everyone did not just walk in and out of the temple, and so that's restricted. So we know she must have been somewhere there in that courtyard. Thinking so. All right, so we have this picture then, maybe this vision of Hannah and just how intense and how serious she was about petitioning God about this. And we get the picture too that she is willing, if God gives her a son, she is willing to devote her son. Give me a son so I can give him back to you. Really is what she is saying there. And then what do you think about Eli's response? First he said, "You're drunk." No, she said, "I'm not drunk." What do you think about Eli's response?
To me, the interesting thing in that is that his first assumption was that she was drunk.
Mm-hmm.
The description of her and how she was praying, literally from the depth of her soul, that, I would think that, would that be your first assumption?
Interesting. Yeah, that he would make that assumption.
Like that?
Maybe he's seen it before, and it's what came to mind. I don't know. Interesting. Yes?
There's a caution to us to be careful in the motives we assign to others.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, if we are judging the spirituality of someone else, we better be careful about that. We may not understand everything to that. Okay? All right. Just kind of want this in our mind, as this thought and this storyline is going forward. Verse 19 says, "Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, 'Because I have asked the Lord for him.'" Samuel, meaning even more directly, the Lord heard. And so this is what we see, in this early part of the life of Samuel. So for a time, Hannah did not go to the yearly sacrifice. She was busy raising a son and preparing him to present him to the Lord. It took a while. The text would say that it's not until after he is weaned that she did that. How interesting. It's like when I think of a child being weaned, I'm thinking about nursing. And 2 or 3 years old, usually a child is weaned. Now, I think there's more to it than that. There's more time involved in that. Maybe being weaned from needing his mother to take care of some things, for him, where he is a little bit more self-sufficient, perhaps. Verse 21 says, when the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Do what seems best to you, Elkanah, her husband, told her. Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For this whole life he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Can you imagine wanting a child, wanting a son that much, that bad? And God blessing you with that, knowing that you've made a promise, you made a vow to God. I'm going to give him right back. And that he is going to be dedicated to your service. That's what she said. And that's a promise that is fulfilled. She makes good for her vow. And she's giving him back to the Lord. Well, Hannah's prayer is quite impressive. She gives thanks, and in chapter 2, there's, first 10 verses or so are this prayer of Hannah. We can't read all of that tonight, but reflect on it just a little bit. Some things here in the first couple of verses, when she was there, at the tent of meeting, presenting her son. My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There's no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. And so she is saying, she is acknowledging there is this rejoicing, there is this strength and this power that she feels, that she receives. And there's thanksgiving. There is this praise that she has with God. And I think it's rather interesting and powerful. And even as it goes on toward the latter part of the prayer, she says in verse 10, it is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. So I'm not sure I know everything that means. But I think there's maybe some points we can draw from that. I'm kind of interested what you're getting from that last part. Is she's concluding some thoughts here from her prayer. Is there anything that stands out to you in that? What do you think about that? In the big picture of the book of 1 Samuel, in some ways the prayer, and particularly verse 10, kind of sets the theme of the book and what it's about and where it's going. And it starts talking about the anointed. Well, we're going to be introduced to the anointed as in Saul, the first king over Israel. No, I say first king. The first man who becomes king. And what we have to understand is they already have a king. God is their king. But this is going to be part of the problem. And they reject God. They want a king like the other nations, okay? But God anoints Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. So there's something to this anointed. But I think you can take that all the way to Christ being the anointed one of God. There's some prophecy here going on. You know, looking at this big picture, some things that she is saying here. And so she's going to leave, but her son is going to stay. Verse 11, then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli, the priest. And again, I don't know how old Samuel was. I'm not thinking he's a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who's ministering before the Lord. You know, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, how would Eli have time to take care of just a toddler? So I'm thinking he must be a little bit older than that. But very soon he is being introduced to the priestly service and some things that go with that. And in fact, even that becomes a question in my mind. It's like, well, why is it and how is it that he could even be a part of what's going on in the temple with Eli the priest? You have any thoughts on that?
Well, the thought is that the children of the priesthood somehow were introduced to those type of activities, and it might be that he was just included along with those in those
Okay.
activities.
Well, I think there's something to that. I think we can take it another step farther, too. You know, it's really not until 2 Chronicles chapter 6 and verse 26, when we're reading some genealogies there, we find that his father Elkanah, you know, he's a Levite. He's a part of the priesthood. So he is from that tribe. And so it's not then unusual that he is going to be involved in the service and the work at the temple, because he is of that tribe. Looking at verse 18, it skips a few verses here to go back to Samuel. We'll be coming back. But in verse 18 it says, but Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when he went up with her husband to the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, may the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord. Then they would go home, and the Lord was gracious to Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. So here's the picture we have, you know, of what's happening and what's going on with Samuel. But now our story takes a side trip. And we have to back up just a few verses here to talk a little bit about Eli. Let's put a little bit of focus back on Eli because God did. That's where he goes with the story. Let's back up to Eli. So here we are still in chapter 2. And maybe some concluding thoughts that we will be able to have at this point about Eli is that he did the will of God. At least in many ways, he did the will of God. He was a good high priest, and he judged Israel for 40 years, chapter 4 and verse 18 would say. So he has kind of a dual role that's going on. Judged Israel for 40 years. Now you remember we're talking about Samson. We're talking about Samson and Eli and Samuel. And which one am I forgetting? There was Samson. There were like 4 judges that probably overlapped in their work, maybe in different parts of Israel. But Eli, for 40 years, judged Israel. But here's a problem. While Eli had some characteristics and traits that were good, some that were not so good. Chapter 2 and verse 12 introduces us to this. Eli's sons were wicked men, and they had no regard for the Lord. And it's like almost nothing else has to be said. Now, there's some explanation given. I mean, like, how could one draw that conclusion? But if nothing else was said, we already know enough. His sons were wicked men. They had, and this is pretty strong language, they had no regard for the Lord. That's pretty powerful right there. Now, what the verses say below here, it talks about how they abused the sacrifices that were brought. So it was custom. It was right. Like when sacrifices were brought and the meat is being cooked, that a servant of the priest would take a prong and put in the meat, and whatever meat came out, well, that was for the priest and his family. It's not the way these sons did it. In fact, they would come and before the meat was even cooked at all or offered. The fat wasn't even burned off. In fact, some would question them, they would take the meat when it's raw, and I would presume choosing the choicest parts. And even when they were questioned about that, why you're doing this, basically they were told, you just hush up. That's none of your business. We'll take care of this. We know people who were bringing sacrifices, they knew better than that. They knew that's not how it was supposed to be done. And they tried calling them on it, but basically Eli's sons said, just be quiet. This is none of your business. And so you see, the point being is that everybody knew and understood, and there's still more to that story, but they knew Eli's sons had no regard for God. And that phrase just kind of rings right there. They had no regard for God. It's hard in some ways to even just try to understand how that happens. Because other things we read about Eli seemingly is all favorable, all good. But verse 17 says, the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight. That's concerning the sacrifice and the meat that they were taking. For they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. Let's understand why this is so serious. That offering belonged to the Lord. And they were abusing and taking what was being given to the Lord. And so I want us to understand just how grave this is, how bold this is, that they would act and respond that way. Don't you wonder a little bit about Eli? And in fact, as we read on, it's not as though he was blind to all of this. Because can you imagine the talk among those who have brought something to be sacrificed and it has been abused? How that talk went around? And again, there's more. There's more. And so it was not as though Eli just didn't know anything that was going on. Verse 22 will tell us here, now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he heard about these things. I want to take a little quick side trip over here for a second. We're shifting gears. I still have this question rolling through my mind when I think Joe asked, or somebody did, about what were women doing regarding issues around the tabernacle, around the tent of meeting.
Well, they polished in brass. So that was, they were mirrors, and they were. I mean, that's what the Bible says, that they...
So inside...
The outside, there were brass that they were cleaning, and it was, didn't have mirrors, but they polished the brass so much that it was shining like a mirror.
So that's inside the courtyard where that is. And just a distinction to be made that it's like, that's not going into the tent of meeting or into the temple as it becomes. When we get to the New Testament and we see, we're talking about the temple up on the Temple Mount, there was actually another, like a fence or a barricade that was built around the outside of that. Only Jews could go inside that portion. Okay, we're getting ahead a little bit, but just trying to have some pictures in our head of this, you know. We're talking about the sanctuary of God, where his presence is. And so, you know, I just want us to appreciate the significance of the place and what is going on right there. And Eli's sons are serving at the tent of meeting. And yet they're doing so in an unlawful way. And they are living lives that, at the very least, we would say is incredibly immoral. And Eli knows about this because their reputation is so well known. Verse 23. So he said to them, Eli that is, why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my son, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. All right, what do you make of this? What do we think now? What do we say about the sons? What do we say about Eli? What do we say about God's position, his view of things right now? What do you say? Corey?
That was a great question you asked. It's almost like, say, if you do something against a citizen, you know, there's levels to the punishment. But if you do something to a cop, there's a higher degree. And if you do something to the judge,
Yeah.
it goes higher. So it's kind of asking a similar question. You say against God himself.
Yeah.
Who's going to mediate?
Yeah, it's like you are sinning against God. Who are you going to get to plead your case? You know, how is this going to go?
Well, but one day God's going to answer that question,
You know?
and he's going to answer that with Jesus, and that's maybe, I don't think that's what Eli intended here with the question, but it is, knowing the full Bible story, it's a pretty remarkable thing to think about, the answer that comes one day.
That there is that mediator or that intercessor for our sins. But then even then, when we're thinking ahead on this, when there is that rejection of Christ, who is there that can go before God for us? And there's a similar thing here, David.
In the next chapter, we're going to find out that Eli bore some responsibility himself for the situation.
Yeah. So initially, at least we know and we can see, it wasn't that Eli did nothing. You know, he went to them, he spoke up, he said something to them. But there's a little bit more to that.
I would characterize that as a too little, too late.
Too little, too late. How in the world did it get this far? It didn't just one day start that they were abusing the sacrifices and just all of a sudden one day there's a reputation of fornication. How did it get this far? So that's one thing. And he did speak to them about this issue and said, Wayne?
Yeah, I guess we see that Eli did what he should have done, but the boys refused. And verse 25 indicates that at that time already it was God's will to put them to death. God had already judged them. God was not going to forgive them. He was going to put them to death.
There is no sign of any remorse on the side of these boys. You know, even their father, the judge and the high priest, their father, the words that he had to speak to them didn't move them, didn't faze them, didn't make them step back and say, oh, hey, we need to look at ourselves. No, it didn't move them at all at that point. Okay, so Eli is going to come under some criticism here. And I think this is something for us to think about and maybe we're going to get to a point, I think, of even making some applications that I hope become helpful to us. Lance?
It says in verse 14 of the next chapter that the Lord swore against the house of Eli that they won't ever return to sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, God has been gracious to like Eli's sons, these priestly people, the example of what people are supposed to follow, and they're doing this. Whereas Exodus, that had happened in the wilderness, God would have killed immediately.
So there seems to have been a period of time where He's not been unaware. But there's been a period of time where this has been going on, and God hasn't struck out there and, hasn't sent fire from heaven. That hasn't happened. We've seen that happen before. But there comes a point where it is though, all right, I've had enough. Like, this is it. Eli, take your response. Well, what is the responsibility of Eli? How would we view that? To set an example. Well, and seemingly, he has been setting an example of what it is to be high priest and judge, because nothing has been said contrary about Eli and his character or conduct. But what else is he to be doing? He's in a position, isn't he? Does he have authority? Yeah, I would say probably the most authority. He's in a position of authority. And he spoke to his sons.
Again, go back to chapter 3, verse 13. Said, he knew of the iniquity because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them.
Okay.
Obviously, he had authority,
Okay.
but he didn't exercise it.
Okay. So there's a little bit more here. Yes, Eli went to his sons. He approached them. He talked to them, about these things. But he failed to respond wisely. He failed to do what he needed to do. He was grieved about what he's seen. What about what he's hearing? He's hearing from people. Their reputation is widespread. Well, why didn't he take them out of position? He had the power to do that. He was the one who was in the position of doing that. But he didn't. And so what is the message that he sends by not taking them out of their position? It's like it's okay. Or that he's turning this blind eye and it doesn't matter. Or could someone say, well, if that were not his sons, he would act differently? Could someone say that? Yeah, probably so. Whether that had anything to do with it or not, I don't know. Ben?
I have different thoughts, and some of it might be just reading between the lines and speculative, and so I don't want to do that. But Eli's very old, the text says. He verbally rebukes his sons, and they just are so dismissive, it seems. Oh, that's old dad. They don't think anything of it. They just continue on. But then in the next chapter, chapter 3, Samuel, who is this younger, again, we don't know the age, but young, he's extremely respectful of Eli. Yes, sir. No, sir. He has manners.
Mm-hmm.
And you read that, and it makes you wonder, did Eli's sons come to the point where they are over a long period of time? Does Eli look back and say, you know what, maybe I've lost out on my own sons where they are. I'm going to help this boy Samuel. A lot of that's speculation, but I don't know. There might be something there.
It is speculation. But yeah, I do wonder about those things. Does he look at his own sons and he realizes, I can't fix this. It's too late. And let's realize that as parents, if we're not working and training when our children are young, it can come to a point where when we have something to say, it won't mean a thing. That they have no respect for us. They've been given no reason even to have respect for us. That we can wait too late for that. Zach, do you? I saw.
Yeah. I wonder if this speaks too as well to just how sinful Israel has become. You can almost see the rationalization, like they're getting with Jewish women, they're not getting with foreign women, and I just think
Yeah, this is bad, but it's not as bad as if they were.
Everything is so evil.
Yeah.
You can easily start to view things. The church can become more evil as the world around rationalizes.
And as we've seen over and over with them, they were influenced by what was going on around them. And as the point we've made, so are we. And so we see how that worked for Israel, which was not so good. We need to be aware of that too. There are applications we can make to these things. This starts becoming very real to us. Yeah.
Yes, I don't want to get ahead of you, but it's kind of to the point that Ben was making. If you look at verse 29, it sounds like God there is confronting Eli, if you will.
Okay.
Or enjoying the fruits, if you will, of what the two boys were doing.
Let's start at verse 27. Now a man of God came to Eli. We don't know who that is. It doesn't say. Interesting. But a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites. Why do you scorn?" He's speaking to Eli now. "Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made to my people?" It's interesting that he says to Eli. It doesn't say that Eli was doing these evil things. His sons were. But it's as though he was it's as though he were doing these sins because he failed to respond and deal with the sins of his sons. Isn't that something? Isn't that something to think about right there? There's a price to pay. In the case of Eli, there is a price to pay for the lack of discipline. So Eli was in that position to have discipline in a much stricter way. He could have removed them from office. He could have banished them. He could have put some righteous priests in place, but he didn't do that. And has come to a point now where the Lord he's had enough of this right here. And as has been pointed out in chapter 3 and verse 13, "For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. Because of the sin he knew about, his sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them." Eli did not respond strongly enough to his sons. And so now God is rebuking Eli for the sins of his sons.
It's interesting and what a lesson for us. From God's perspective, Eli was condoning what his sons were doing, essentially by not speaking against him. And what about us? If we don't speak out against sin, against wickedness and evil, are we condoning?
So I think this is part of the application that we have to make. I think it's very real. Not saying anything can become just as bad as taking part in the sin. It's like we're condoning what's going on. And the necessity, the need of calling us out. And sometimes that's really hard when it's our whole family. And sometimes we get a little, we got those blinders on. And we don't see things that we should way back here until we get way up here. Now we realize, and it is just so far out of hand now, we should have dealt with this way back there, but we just couldn't see it. Is kind of what can happen. You're saying,
As from when they were younger, of course, all this is speculation.
yep.
But I think the point probably, if he was a high priest and he was a judge, he was a very busy person.
Yeah.
However, God still expected him.
Still held him accountable.
His household.
Yeah.
And I think we've all known people that were good as gold,
Yeah.
but they spent so much time
I have heard, and I know Ben has heard, preachers fall into a trap sometime. So busy trying to save the world that you lose your own children. You can get so busy about things. Look, all of us can make some application that we can all get so busy with life that we lose taking care of life. We lose our children. Jake?
Kind of a random but a very connected worldly statistic that really solidifies what Sandy's saying is, think of if you took first generation owned companies, 30% of those companies on average survive to the second generation. So if we were to start a business in here, only 30% of those businesses would make it or be picked up by the second generation.
Mm-hmm.
Of those 30% that are successful into the second generation, 12% of those go on to be successful. So being a business owner, being busy and focused on other things and not the important things that you need to focus on is likely the crucial point that they fall into as well.
Do we see the same thing in Christianity sometime? You have that first generation Christian. On fire. Man, just hot. Studying. Fervent. Telling their neighbors, telling their co-workers about the gospel. And maybe their children become Christians too. And they're Christians. Not the same fervency, You got that third generation. How often do we even see third generation Christians? Fourth generation? Oh, it happens. It does. Interesting how narrow that funnel gets. The third and fourth, fifth generation. How often do we see that? Is there something to that? Is there something there, Ben? Kind of wrap us up.
I don't want to take away from those comments because I agree with them. But at the same time, the biblical record doesn't say anything about when his sons were young. And
It doesn't.
How he trained them right.
It doesn't.
Eli might have possibly been a tremendous father who taught them the right way. And especially if his treatment of Samuel is some indication, perhaps. We just don't know. But what we do know is when he was able to stop them, he couldn't and he didn't.
Yeah.
And even if his training of them in their youth had been correct and godly, then they made their own choice and they went a different way, and he still could have done something about it.
And that's the bigger picture. That's the bigger point with this. There are always consequences for not honoring God. And Eli was not honoring God when he didn't deal with some things in the way God wanted him to. All right, good. So glad you're here tonight. Thank you for your comments. God willing, we're moving on chapter 4 on Sunday. Good to see you.